The Lord be with you.
Absolutely.
Good morning. I apologize for interrupting such riveting conversation. To introduce myself, I am Rebecca Motley, the new director of adult formation. And I am so pleased to be with you all this morning as we hear from our speakers. Before we get started, just a few words for those of you who are joining us via Zoom. Welcome. I ask that you keep yourself muted. And when we get to the Q&A section, raise your hand. There should be an icon somewhere on your screen that is a hand raised. Click that. That way we know that you have a question you would like to ask and we will call on you. We are just exploring that for now, and hopefully it works a little bit better as opposed to waiting for a break in conversation because there tends to be a lag over Zoom. So we're just exploring that. Before we get started, let us join in prayer. Mothering God, on this day where we celebrate all our mothering figures in our lives, we thank you. We come before you humbly, knowing that in you we find our strength and our comfort. Be with us as we explore these heavy topics that affect us even in ways we don't realize. It is in your most beloved name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I would like to introduce our speakers this morning, Jacinta Greene and Meagan Alderton. I got your bio straight from the website, so.
Official.
They are up to date.
A native of Richmond, Virginia, Jacinta Greene is a proud graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University. Born into a family of educators, Miss Greene learned early and firsthand the importance of a great education and the doors it can open for the future. Miss Greene moved to Alexandria in 2002 and quickly became involved in community activism by serving as vice president of the Alexandria Young Democrats, and for 5 years served as chair of volunteer coordinator for the Alexandria Democratic Committee. Ms. Greene spent 10 years in corporate America before venturing out on her own as an independent marketing consultant and meeting planner. Her main passion centers around advocacy for disadvantaged women, children, and civil rights for all. This passion led her to the Alexandria Commission for Women, where she has served as a commissioner and first chair for 10 years. Ms. Greene also serves on the board for the 12 Days of Christmas, the DC chapter, a nonprofit organization that raises money for disadvantaged children in the DC metro area. Other volunteer activities include serving as coordinator for the Ruby Tucker Readers Organization, which teaches a love for reading and literacy to underserved children in Alexandria. In 2018, Ms. Greene was elected to the Alexandria City School Board and takes pride in advocating for quality and equitable education for all children in her beloved Alexandria, Virginia. The quote that Ms. Greene centers her life around is, 100 years from now, it will not matter what my bank account was, the sort of house I lived in, or the kind of car I drove. But the world may be different because I was important in the life of a child. Welcome. Meagan Alderton is a special education program quality specialist at the DC Special Education Cooperative, where she has previously served as director of professional development. Ms. Alderton was first elected to the school board in 2018 and is the second African-American female to be elected to the role of board chair in the history of Alexandria City Public Schools. Following in the footsteps of Shirley Tyler, she was reelected as the board chair in 2022. While on the school board, Ms. Alderton has served on the Superintendent's Evaluation Committee to help develop the Superintendent Evaluation Tool and Process, as well as on the Education Design Team for the Connected High School Network. She co-drafted legislation approved by the Virginia General Assembly to bolster pre-licensure preparation for teachers in the area of crisis prevention and positive behavioral intervention and support. Ms. Alderton received a master's degree in special education from Townsend University and a Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies and Women's Studies from York University in Canada. She lives in Alexandria's West End with her husband, who has been with ACPS for more than 20 years, and their 2 children. In her free time, she enjoys strength training and playing the piano. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Strength training is probably going to be the one that you need the most always.
Yes,
Always,
indeed.
Yes. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone here in the room. Good morning, everyone on Zoom. My name is Meagan Alderton, and I'm the chair here at the Alexandria School Board. Longtime public educator, 18 plus years at this point. So teaching is what I do. So I'm going to tell you, don't expect to just sit here and get input from the screen. I'm going to try to get you guys to do a little bit of engaging and talking to one another as we move along. So we were asked to come and share about, our strategic plan. And our strategic plan is actually very unique in the sense that we actually are calling out in our strategic plan racial equity. We are saying the word race. We are not running from the word. We are talking about explicitly how it impacts our education system. So I'll just start off with a little bit about the school division. If you are not aware, we have about 15,500 students at this point in time. We have a very large budget, as you can see. Our operating budget, which you see here, is about $377 million, which was recently approved by City Council. So we're excited about that. We also have a capital improvement budget, which is that $500 million number that you see. That budget is spanned over 10 years. As you know, in the city of Alexandria, we have a lot of aged facilities. So we have a very big budget for improving those facilities over time. Our per pupil allotment is actually pretty high, which is also good. We spend about $18,732 per pupil. I always say we're not resource deficient in Alexandria. We're actually very resource rich, which is great. But a lot of times it's more about how you allocate your resources.
Amen.
That makes the difference. And so that's what we're spending a lot of work on.
Yeah, I just one important point with that 377 million, over 80% of that is for personnel. So not all of that is going, towards, operating. It goes, to personnel because we have to be personnel heavy when it comes to teaching and making sure that kids are taken care of in a school system, particularly at the elementary school level.
Could you tell us the average salary of a teacher in Alexandria?
I think
so.
Starting.
Yeah, so average starting, so there's different levels. If you're starting with a bachelor's at this point, you're in the 50s, which is really good. When I started with a bachelor's, we were in the 30s. So we've definitely been keeping up. With a master's starting, you're about 10,000 more than that, which is good. 75% or more of our educators actually have master's degrees. So that actually boosts our average salary. So I think the number, don't quote me, but I think the number for our average is probably close to 80 because you have, your teachers who are, well in, 20 years. And then you got your teachers who are first year, bring it all together. You're somewhere around probably about 70 to 80 for an average salary. Any other questions before about that? You can also see here, I think what's very interesting about the city of Alexandria is the actual demographic makeup of the students. And the challenge is, because I do want to share some of the challenges. The challenge is that that demographic doesn't necessarily match the demographic of the city residents. And so it's very hard for people to understand, I believe, the needs of the school division because it doesn't mirror the needs of the city as a whole, if that makes sense. So for example, 60% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. So that means 60% of our students are at the poverty line. When you look around the city of Alexandria, you're not seeing that, just walking around town, going to Old Town in your neighborhood, whatever. So the also interesting thing though, is that most of the people who live in the city don't necessarily have school-age children who are in the schools. So it's
About 20%.
Yeah, it's somewhere around 20%. So it's a very interesting dynamic to deal with. And especially when you're talking about racial equity, how do you bring along a community who doesn't necessarily fully understand everything that's happening within the school system? We have a lot of languages, lots and lots of languages. We have our students, we're at 123 different native languages in our school division. Kids from over 100 different countries. So that's another, very interesting dynamic to address. So that makes it nice to be resource rich because we have some very unique needs that we have to address. Excuse me. Yes.
About what percent do you have a sense of where the children don't have much exposure to English?
We are more than 35%. More than 35% of our kids are English language learners. So that's over a third. Yeah. And remember, they're coming at all different times. Our International Academy, for example, they're taking kids, tomorrow.
Yeah.
Who've just shown up here.
Yes.
Afghanistan, wherever. So it's a very unique situation to be in. Yes.
Do you know the percentage of kids that are homeless?
I do not have those numbers, but I can share that with you. I don't know the actual percentage, but we have plenty of students who live in shelters. They're in shelter care. That's not foreign to us at all.
One final question about of these languages, about how many are we able to support because we have active adults that can communicate with those children?
Good question.
That's a good question. I think that's the skill of an English language teacher. We have, what we call EL teachers, and they are basically skilled to, address no matter where the kids come from. So it's not necessarily all about being 100% fluent in the language as closing that language gap as much as we can. We do have a very great, what we call the FACE Center. And some of our heaviest populations speak Amharic, Arabic, and then Spanish. So we do have people on staff at ACPS who can help those families. So a lot of the work comes with, being able to communicate with those families to support the kids. So we have people who are able to do that. All right. So there's some stats for you. We like data. So about our strategic plan, we actually came together to decide, what is our vision? The board worked really intensely, had some very interesting conversations to come up, narrow it down. I mean, when you're talking about all the things, I just shared a lot of everything that we deal with. And when you're doing a strategic plan, you really have to narrow down what your vision and mission are, which is really difficult. But we got it down to these two things. Our vision is actually to empower our students. We want them to thrive because the world is diverse, the world is ever changing. And we need to be producing students who are able to function in an ever-changing world. So that is our vision for every single student. Our mission, like the actual action, is to inspire our students. And I always like to highlight, address barriers to learning. Address the barriers to learning. That is what we do. That is what we are in the business of. And it's really important, especially when we're talking about racial equity, because there are just things in our society that are, you know, barriers to our kids, not anything due to their own fault. It's just because of how we function. And our job is to really call out what those barriers are. And as educators, we have to remove them so that our kids can have access to a high quality education. And so I always say what we're in the business of doing right now, addressing barriers. I like to say removing barriers. That's what we need to do. Our core values we've established, we want to be welcoming. When you have people from so many different places who speak so many different languages, from so many different socioeconomic backgrounds, we want to be a welcoming community that welcomes all people, no matter where they come from. We want to be empowering, right? We want to empower our students. I think gone are the days of teacher or educator as someone who just imparts information. We are facilitators of learning. And so when we do that, we empower our students to become lifelong learners, which is really important. We have to be equity focused. I just don't know how you can function in a school system at this point in time without being focused on equity. I have a hard time even seeing it. I think now we're starting to call it out, but we have to be equity focused. We have to be innovative because of all the different challenges that we do have to address. We're not going to be able to do this work using old cookie cutter tools, right? We have to move forward and be innovative and think about the population we serve. And we have to be results driven. Data, right? I mean, I hate to be like that person who's like, oh, data again. But it really is the driver, because you have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know where you are in order to know where you're going and how to get there. We've been talking a lot since 2020 about what we're calling a dual pandemic. I'll give you guys an opportunity to speak at this point. We've got a bunch of images here. What are your thoughts on that? Anybody on Zoom can raise their hand.
I think for teachers and for students, being apart, not being together, slowed down social, emotional, even knowledge. Well, you know, I used to teach and I was so grateful that I didn't have to use Zoom to teach, because I know it's really important to be physically with the kids that you're working with.
Yes.
So I think it's had a hard consequence for both teachers and their students, particularly the most vulnerable, which are often the newest to the school, coming from countries other, than from here. So those are two things that I'm thinking about. And wearing masks, I know, is, has been necessary, but it also keeps a barrier between it. I come back to church and there's some people I see that I know that have masks on and I'm not sure who they are. So anyway, so I know it's good for kids to be back in class with their teachers now.
We're social people. Isolation is devastating.
So you guys are really talking about dealing with a global health pandemic, right? And trying to navigate keeping everybody safe while trying to keep everyone educated and engaged in the education process. So the pandemic, no question, has had devastating effects on everybody involved in the education world. I mean, everybody, but in the education world, absolutely, yes.
Of course, the other piece of this is the racism that we're talking about and that had, and so we're talking about, I'm just gonna use the word separation.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, we find separation for our health. And on the other hand, we find separation is killing us with knowing one another and so forth.
Right. Did you want to comment on anything, Ms. Green?
I do. So I run a reading program within our public housing here in Alexandria. And as school board members, we can zoom into classrooms, and I wanted to see where my kids were. It was very hard because sometimes we couldn't find them. You know, mom and dad have to work multiple jobs even during the pandemic to be able to survive. So the kids are at home, you know, by themselves. They may get on Zoom, they may not, you know. If there's an older child that's responsible helping the younger ones, they will. So, you know, when I'm not seeing them in the classrooms, I'm going and knocking on doors. We lost quite a few students that did not come back after the pandemic. So it's extremely hard. The pandemic is still affecting us in many ways in the education. I cry because they mean so much to me. And when you can't physically see them and be with them, it's extremely difficult. So I made sure that I kept that reading program going during the pandemic. And sometimes it was just me because people were afraid to come out. So it's been so extremely difficult, particularly at a school board level, where, you know, you have to govern, you know, something that you've never done before. You've been elected to a position and you want the best for your students, you want the best for your staff. And we witnessed something that we've never witnessed before. And it's not just us, it was across the country. So it was very difficult, but you know, now that we're back and now we're able to control it, it's so much better. But still we're seeing effects that happen to them that will probably continue to come out for years to come. But luckily the federal government has put forth resources to help mitigate that. So that will be very helpful. But yeah, we have a long way to go.
And I'd love to just talk about the intricacy of this before moving on really quickly, because remember, you know, this dual pandemic just is also very fascinating, because what we saw from, remember, the majority of the families that we serve are actually, you know, 70+% are kids of color. There was a real fear amongst those families about being exposed to COVID.
Yeah.
Because what you have to remember, and this is where we talk about systems, these families have been victims of a healthcare system that doesn't support them, or that they don't feel supports them or cares for them. So why would I want to, this is life or death. If I'm a person of color, if I'm a person who lives in poverty, this is a life or death situation for me. So as much as I want my child to get an education, I also want to keep them alive. I want to keep myself alive because I work in the gig economy. And if I get COVID, I can't work. You know, so it's so complicated. And what this has brought up is just the complexity of our systems overall. This was just a symptom.
We have an online question.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
John Woods, go ahead.
My question is as much a comment. We have seen a lot about doing everything using the internet. And yet we've got so many people in the city of Alexandria that are not only not able or are illiterate, but have no access to the internet. How's the school system handling, particularly the foreign immigrants and the poor people in accessing the internet? You can't go to school on Zoom if you don't have a computer.
Right. So that's a great question. And a lot of our work initially at the start of the pandemic. So I will say this, I think we were forward thinking. We had a 1-to-1 tech ratio for our students well before the pandemic started. So we really didn't have any issue with making sure that every kid had a device. That wasn't necessarily, there were school divisions who had to figure that out. We weren't in that boat because like I said, I started teaching in Alexandria in 2005. And very quickly after that, we had a superintendent who was very much about a 1-to-1 ratio for technology. So at this point in time, we were pretty much there. Did we have to do some, buying some more things and, figuring out, tablets or versus Chromebooks for kindergartners? Yes, right. We had to do that work, but we made sure that kids had access to technology. We also had to make sure that if they did not have internet, then we went directly to those families to make sure they could get access. So we really capitalized on hotspots, things like Kajits, that kids could access the internet from home or wherever they were. So absolutely, we had to focus on that. You can't get on Zoom if you don't have internet. You can't access, and the reality is beyond Zoom. I mean, there are so many platforms that we use now that it's great for the kids to be able to access from home. Well, they can't do that if they don't have internet. So that's a big part of what we do. And the funding that Ms. Greene was speaking of from the federal government was very instrumental in helping us to continue that and refresh that at a basically a breakneck pace.
Yeah, and to add on to the technology for each child, I believe that superintendent was with us around about 2009, 2010, when we had Snowmageddon and the kids were out of school for like 2 weeks. She was forward thinking then to be like, this can't happen again. So let's get a computer, let's get a tablet for each child if we have to be out of the school so that we can still have them connected. So Alexandria was far ahead of other school divisions because of that, which was good on our part. So when the pandemic hit and we had to shut down on Friday, March 13th, we were well ahead of the game. So we were up and running on Monday, March 16th, because of that superintendent that was so forward thinking back in 2010.
Just to toot Westminster's horn a little bit, one of our member families, Elizabeth Hoover, who was the chief technology.
We love Dr.
As
Hoover.
ACPS is a member of Westminster.
Oh, we did. Oh, we didn't know that.
Yeah, she's an affiliate. Anyway, yes, they're a member.
That is one. Yeah, Dr. Hoover. She had us up and running.
There you go.
Yeah, very
She's
thankful for her.
She's a rock star.
Yes.
Real quick, we have a comment from Melinda. Shout out to the PTA Council for providing some of the funding for mobile hotspots for students who needed them.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you, Melinda. That's right.
Yeah.
Shout out to PTAC.
Yeah.
And my wife's on PTAC, so I'm gonna. I'm done with the show.
PTAC does great work with supporting our schools. We appreciate them greatly.
Yeah, and we have so many partners.
Mhm.
I mean, we are not, when I say resource rich, it's not just stuff. It's the partners and the people in the community that work with us too.
I've read things that say that it really helps a student if their parents are also educated, or if their parents at least care about education. And it would seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think probably a lot of the white parents are better educated than a lot of the Hispanic and people that are coming from other countries. And so I would think that would be a real problem for these kids who have parents who can't be at home, they've got to go out and work. And on top of that, their parents maybe don't really emphasize education as much as the white parents might.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say you're wrong. And I think going back to, as we move through, going back to systemic racism, it's a system that's been built to allow that to happen, right? The system has been built for certain people to have access to education and certain people to not, or certain people having to be more concerned about putting food on the table than they can about sitting home and doing homework. That's all a part of the structure, not that necessarily any one person in this room, did it, but we've all participated in some way. I always say, in 18 years of public education, I've been a contributor to the problem because I live within the system. And sometimes we don't even recognize, the ways in which we continue to perpetuate it. Lots of questions.
Yes, I love it. I love it.
Nick.
Well, I was going to say, the in-person populations were much more impacted by the pandemic than those that had already been very used to using email and Zoom meetings, and well, not necessarily Zoom, but whatever they were using. They always had a computer on their desk. I mean, we live in a community, we live in a senior community, and we were an in-person community. You did not need to know technology. And as a fact, we were very strongly affected socially, the members of the community. Luckily, my husband and I were computer literate, but there had not been any need for it. And the same way with the jobs that did not need computer skills, they were in-person jobs are the ones that were greatest affected by the pandemic, both socially and economically.
Exactly.
Just wanted to say that with everything I listen to, every speech, every communication I listen to now, I recognize, yes, we're in the midst of racism at a peak. Yes, we've been in the midst of a pandemic at the peak, but we're also in the midst of truth and a pandemic of truth, where on the one hand, we're trying to get out how to stay safe. And, oh, this is the science, this is the truth. And on the other hand, people running from the truth saying, oh, this is going to make you feel bad or whatever. So I think that has to be thought about in every aspect of what we think about and talk about.
Absolutely.
Right. If I can say one thing to the parents, the uneducated parents, you're absolutely right. And those parents that do not speak English, they oftentimes do not feel comfortable advocating for their students' education. So we provide significant resources to help those students. We call them parent liaisons, that speak their language, that they're able to go to them for a resource if they're having an issue with the teacher, or if something's happening with their kids in the school. We provide the resources for that, so that they have someone that they can go to.
All right, so I'm gonna try to play this video. Hopefully you guys will be able to hear it. I don't know how this all works, but we're gonna see. If not, I'll give you the gist of it. But if you have lived in the city of Alexandria for a while, I'm sure you've heard of the Secret Seven. But this is just a quick video clip, because it kind of, what I want to get to is that you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from. So just take a look. Hopefully this.
Last Crowd School, which is around the corner. My father was president of PTA. Right after Christmas time, the school ran out of chalk, paper, pencils. And so they got an appointment with T.C. Williams, who was the superintendent, to go to talk to him about the supplies that Last Crouch needed. The school build office was around on Washington Street at the time. They went to his office at the time appointed. They made them wait 25 minutes standing up outside his office. When he finally brought them into the office to see them, he did not greet them, he didn't shake their hand, he didn't acknowledge anything. He made them stand in his office while he sat down and tell them what the hell they were there for, and that's the words he used. What are you niggas here for? My daddy, thank God my daddy had learned to keep his temper. When they told him what was the problem and what the supplies that were needed, he said, oh, I can take care of that. And he got on his intercom and he called somebody downstairs in supply and said, the niggas need some supplies. Send some chalk, some pencils, and some paper. And about 10 minutes later, this person arrives at the office with one box of 10 sticks of chalk, one box of 20 pencils, and one ream of paper. And this is for a student body of 200 and some students. at last crops. And he said, this is what you get, take it and leave.
So, you know, that really wasn't all that long ago. I feel like sometimes when we talk about, you know, the civil rights movement in that time, sort of post Brown versus Board of Education, we talk about it as if it was 100 years ago. Not, right? If you think about the Brown versus Board of Education decision happening in 1954, and then it really took 20 years after that just to get traction everywhere, right? You're in the 1970s. So this is like, these are recent moves. And not even to take it back, you know, further, these are 400+ wounds that we're trying to heal.
What year was that, the man, I didn't recognize him who was speaking, but.
So he was talking about T.C. Williams, who was superintendent at the time, and his superintendency started in the 30s.
Yes, and he was the superintendent of Alexandria City Public Schools for 33 years.
That was Nelson Greene.
That was Nelson Greene,
yes.
yes.
Greene Funeral Home, yeah.
And he's
Mr.
been
Greene.
on city council.
Yes, and he
was on the
school board too, and he just passed away recently. So he did. God bless his soul.
Oopsie.
Hello.
Uh-oh.
Talk about dual.
I can fix it. I can fix it.
While she's doing that, I just want to say the data chart that you showed is so important for your constituents to know what you're doing, what the percentage of people that make up the school district are. It's just really important to have that data so people can know how their money is being spent.
That's
and
right.
buy into, you know, the programs of the school. It's really
Agreed.
important.
Agreed. Yes, it's very important. We're a third of the city's budget. So it's important for people to know where that money is going. You're absolutely right.
We assign ourselves some reading as a board this year. Mary Frances Winters is an author, and she writes about one of the first things she's written about is what she calls Black fatigue. And I'm just using that here as a framework for a definition. And she defines Black fatigue as the intergenerational impact of systemic racism on the physical and psychological health of Black people. Well, we could take that a step further, right? And say that systemic racism has an intergenerational impact on all of the people who operate in that system, period. Doesn't matter who you are operating within the system, it has an intergenerational impact in how you pass down ideals, how you pass down behavior, no matter who you are. All of those behaviors, all of those things come together to form how we operate as communities. And they don't just disappear, right? It doesn't just change because we say, oh, well, you know, segregation it's over now.
No.
Right? It's over. We did that. We did civil rights. Yes, that's great. But we've got, like I said, 400 years of systems that we need to dismantle. Because the reality is that those systems have operated to determine who's educated, to determine who gets what jobs, to determine who gets good health care and who doesn't. It's not over. I think we all want it to be, but it's not over. So with our strategic plan, we always talk about this kind of change because it is very painful. Ms. Greene, is it painful?
It's so painful.
It's painful. It is brutal. You have to wear armor to do this.
Yeah.
You got to get up every day with your armor on because I believe that people want to change. But when they become impacted by that change, the pushback can be visceral. In order to change culture, we've got to have a plan to do that. And that's what our strategic plan is all about. It's really about a change in culture.
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Do you have any idea how many students in the city of Alexandria go to private schools and what their demographics are?
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't, and I don't think it's necessarily like the majority of families and the kids send their kids to private school. I don't think that. I think that the majority of people who live in the city actually just don't have kids.
Only 20% of city residents have kids, school-age kids in Alexandria.
Right.
Oh, that's the 20%, not.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how does that compare to the country as a whole? What percentage of families?
That's pretty unique.
Yeah, it's gonna be by, city by city, I would venture to say, a lot of younger families live more in suburbs and, that are, but as far as I think, I think closer to cities, you're not seeing like cities like Alexandria that are closer to Washington, DC, you're not seeing a lot of school age kids. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's expensive.
Yeah.
Affordability it has a lot to
Do with it. Right.
Usually when people have a family, they want to buy a home, they want to, do all these things. And, to buy a home here in the city, it's not cheap, right? You're not buying a $200,000 house here. You're not even buying a $500,000 house anymore.
Yeah.
So people often, will move, maybe to Fairfax or further out, because it's just, they can afford to.
Yeah.
So,
And I heard a statistic recently, this is not Alexandria specific, but the majority of kids in the country go to public schools, not private schools. I think it's like 2 out of 10 students attend a private school versus public school. So public school is the majority of where people are sending their kids.
all right, so what about our strategic plan? What's in that? So we talked about what a strategic plan accomplishes, so I'll skip that. Why racial equity? I think we talked a lot about that already, so I'll move on. I know we're.
So you're talking about barriers. Could you give us some examples of some of the barriers that you can?
Sure, absolutely. So let's see, for example, barriers related to racism. I think one of the things that we talked about was, coming from a set of parents who have a, certain amount of education and time versus those who don't. I'll give a story. I'm going to give a story because this really sort of hit home with me when I was on the campaign trail. The big sort of talk politically right now is about critical race theory. And so there's this notion that well, you keep talking about race, you're just like dividing people even further. And, I think that it's really just a difference in ideology. A parent came up to me and she said, well, it's basically just people who work hard and do what they got to do and people who don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real belief, right? If we have this culture, you pick yourself up by the bootstraps, right? Immigrants came here and they worked hard and they did what they had to do to get the things that they need. And so I said, okay. And she kept saying, so, that's where the issue comes from, right? I said, so then what you're saying to me, I'm just clarifying, because I do want to have this discussion with you. I said, what you're saying to me is that for some reason, inherently, all of my Latino families, all of my immigrant families, my Black families, they just haven't worked hard enough. And somehow all of my white families just have. And she said, I said, because I'm talking to you in data right now. The data that I have shows me that for whatever reason, I've got this huge chunk of kids who aren't achieving commensurate with their white peers. So according to your analysis, their families just aren't working hard enough. I said, is that what you're saying? And she said, well, I can't say that. I said, what I would like for you to understand is that when I talk about systemic racism, what we're talking about is what are the ways that even I have contributed to perpetuating a system that allows this group of students, just because of who they are, what they look like, how we categorize them, to continue to not have the same access to a high quality education as their white peers. That's all I'm saying. And she's like, oh, well, we should talk about that. Right? So those are the barriers. That's an example of the barrier. It is a societal assumption that you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you work hard, and because that's what we do in America. It doesn't acknowledge that we intentionally kept certain people down so that we could have societal power, so that we could have economic power, right? If I want economic power, I got to keep somebody else down, right? I keep them down with education. I always say, and I will say this over and over again, we are doing a disservice if we don't produce Black and brown children who are literate. We're doing the slave master's bidding. That was the tactic of slavery. Our country was founded on that. Can't teach them how to read. You're gonna, if I find you reading, you're gonna get whipped. Why is that? I gotta keep you from having your own knowledge so that I can control.
And I've heard Hispanic parents say, you want to teach my children in Spanish so that they can be dishwashers and housekeepers. I want my kid to learn English so that they can go to law school or medical school or college or whatever. And so I think that's one of the things that I particularly am in favor of is if they don't speak English, let's teach them English so that they, have those same opportunities. I'll tell you a story from my background. I went to school in Chicago, south side of Chicago. My elementary school was integrated before Brown versus the Board of Education, which was very unusual.
Yeah.
But the high school that I went to was all Black. It was Hyde Park and Woodlawn. Woodlawn was a Black ghetto. Hyde Park is an integrated neighborhood. That's where the University of Chicago is. So you've got a wide range of people in that neighborhood.
President Obama
I
lives
was
there.
tutoring a Black guy who I knew very well because we sat next to each other in choir. And he was from the ghetto area in Woodlawn. And he was supposed to be reading The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, which I hadn't even read. And I was asking him if he had a place at home where he could study, where he could read and not be bothered by anybody else in the family. And of course, that just didn't exist in his household. And the best I could do for him was to say, how about you go to the Woodlawn Library because everybody there is reading and maybe it'd be a little easier for you to focus on this book. So do we have those kinds of barriers with kids? I would say,
Oh,
I think today that
absolutely.
a lot of these kids, they don't have their own bedroom. They don't have a desk and a lamp and
Multiple children sleeping in one bed.
Yeah.
One room, one room apartments with multiple generations.
Yeah.
That's real.
Multiple families in, they each have a bedroom, so 3-bedroom apartments, could be 3 families in that apartment or more. Yeah.
So can they, how are they going to study? Can we have them be able to stay at the school to do their homework before they go home to this one room?
Yep, that's our work in removing barriers, right?
Okay.
So knowing that, one of the things that we have to work, pretty intensely on is our community partnerships. Where are places that kids can go after school time? Because there's a time that they're in school and then there's a time that they're out of school. And so how do we shape our out of school time so that kids can have that, peace and quiet or, a quiet place to do work or someone who's available to support them in studying and doing homework. And that's where our various partnerships come in to support that. But yes, that's an example. That's another example of barriers that we have to remove. And it just shows you how complex it is.
Well, another thing that bothered me when my kids were in the Alexandria schools, they'd get science projects and have science fairs. And I'd go to the science fairs to see, what the kids did. And some of these kids were working on these things at home, and it was clear that the parents had done these fantastic
Yeah.
things.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, and I thought, it really is unfair to say, this kid is competing against that kid when this kid has a one-room apartment and a parent who's working all the time, and this kid has got a father or a mother who will do this fantastic project with them,
Mhm.
but maybe really doing a lot of it for them and then saying they're competing. And I said, really, we ought to make sure that whatever they do, they had to do it in school and they had to do it with teachers advising them so that it's a more level playing field
Yeah.
for these.
And that's the job of our strategic plan. It's like, how do we level the playing field?
Yeah.
And the challenge with equity is that when you're leveling the playing field, it doesn't mean getting everybody the same thing. It's not making sure everybody has the same thing.
Mhm.
Because if you don't have, I've got to put a lot more resources into you to build up in the area that you don't have, where your peer next to you has. And that's why I say, it gets visceral at that point.
Mhm.
Because, I think people love equity until they're the ones who feel like something's been taken away from them or they're not being paid attention to. So how are we on time? Because I know we were.
We actually are, we've only got like 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, so I
'Cause
did,
we can
yeah,
talk about this all
I
day.
know.
I know.
And there's so much like, we could do a whole nother session just on like our data.
Mhm.
Which if you want, I'd be happy to do.
Yes.
So please, I'm putting that on the table for sure. But in order to figure out where we've been, again, we had to really dig into data. So I'm going to share these slides so that you can have access. I put a link there for our strategic planning workbook because that's the information that we use to come up with our goals, right? We had to say what's actually happening with our kids in order for us to prioritize what we needed to address.
And let me just make a quick point. So this strategic planning committee included community members from all walks of life, even the church community. We had people involved from our churches as well. And so it brought together different mindsets on what should our strategic plan be in Alexandria City Public Schools.
And, go ahead.
Just quickly, when was, I'm just coming into the school system as a kindergartner.
Oh.
When was the plan
Put together?
put together? Yeah,
2019.
2019. So right before the pandemic.
Correct.
Yes.
And so we had
Which is the
to,
other beauty.
yeah, we had to do some revisions. And, yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, so we got our
Yes.
plan, right? We're like ready to go, and then boom, came COVID. So a lot of when you look at our dashboard, for example, one of the things you'll see is that, some areas that we started out, actually at the start of the pandemic year actually dropped a little bit because COVID,
Yes.
right? So, I think that's been probably the biggest challenge, is just trying to continue to push everything and push this work through the pandemic. But I will say we have, there've been challenges, but then there's also been some eye-opening moments that allowed us to be innovative in order to achieve some of our goals. So just so that within our strategic plan, I have at the top, so the items at the top, those are our like big goals, right? These are the big goals. We want to make sure that we're systemically aligned, that we are pushing for instructional excellence. Students have access and support, as we talked about. We want to make sure that we're strategically allocating our resources. We're resource rich, but how are we using those resources in order to achieve these goals? And then how are we engaging our families and communities, which we also talked about, in order to have success. What comes from that is what we call our key performance indicators. And so what we're saying is that if we see these things improve in the next 5 years, then we have met our strategic goals. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So if we see improvements in kindergarten readiness, if we see in students improvements in reading proficiency, math proficiency, And disproportionality is a big part of this. And I'll show you why. If you look at our dashboard, we basically have broken up all of our sort of, you know, I call them reporting areas, but we report in these areas because what we want to see is, are there disproportionalities in performance between kids based on race and ability, right? If we see that, then we have to call it out and acknowledge it and do something about it. So this is an example of our dashboard at the end of the 2020-21 school year, which is the year that we basically came back from the pandemic. The first portion of that year was still virtual, and then we were gradually pulling more students back into school buildings. So this was the summative from that year. But if you look at what we're measuring for academics, we're using math for language arts and math. We want to see ninth graders on track. That's a big, big area that we never really paid attention to because we weren't looking at our data, I think, closely enough. But if we're going to have improvements in graduation rates, we need to be looking at the percentage of ninth graders who are on track at the end of their ninth grade year.
Is this data only for ninth graders?
No, this is all grades.
So kindergarten up.
Yes. So this data is for all grades. And so what happens is we have our schools who have their, so this is like district-wide data. And then everybody uses their data and they input it into this, right? So at George Mason Elementary School, they're charged with having regular meetings about their data, which are usually quarterly, and then that gets put here. And they have to have discussions. So for example, if we're having issues with, you know, readiness, the PALS readiness benchmark, right? Then our leaders at that particular school are sitting down there saying, here's where we are, what's missing? Why aren't we getting there, and what resources do we need to put in place to get us there? So while this is division-wide, every single school is charged with this same data. You don't get to pick and choose what you're going to work on, right? We've already decided in our strategic plan, we've decided as a school division, this is the data we're all working on. You don't get a pass. And so that's that systemic alignment. A lot of times before, I can say this, I worked in ACPS, it was like, oh, well, you're in George Mason, we're doing this, and at Mount Vernon, we're doing this, and you know, GW, we decided to do this. But that doesn't do anything to move the whole division forward. And you can't address racial equity if some people get to ignore it and some people don't.
Another quick question, looking at the data, I'm wondering, so for the Hispanic, I'm sort of startled by the Hispanic or Latino category here. In terms of equity, do you think the numbers, do they tend to be typically underrepresented across all these categories? Do you think because of language barriers or economics, or I was just noticing in the classroom, I got to finally go into the classroom for the first time this week, and it was really fun. And among the Hispanic kids, and they're kindergartners, they're really young, but they use a lot of Spanish in the classroom, and they can switch to English, which is awesome that they're learning that switch, which is a huge skill that will serve them in life. But I just, you know, what do you think the main challenges for that group? Is it racism, or do you think it's language barriers or economics, or can you not?
I think it's multiple things, but the one thing I will say is that educators are taught to be educators in a racist system. I have a degree in education. I was taught to be an educator in a racist system. And so the challenge with this work is that there's a lot of internal work that we have to do within ourselves.
That's right.
as educators. But we have to call this out, right? So I can now say, you know, exactly what you're saying, but what is going on? How is it that we are not able, why do we keep having this disproportionality with Latino students? Because I will say this, I think while we should acknowledge those barriers that you're bringing up, language, things that we've talked about, you know, access. How am I a barrier too? We have to have that honest conversation. And so what the other thing that we're doing to address this is that our staff has to participate in equity trading. You have to get cultural competency training. You actually have to sit down with your peers and self-reflect and say, what is it that I am doing? I'm always talking about multi-tier systems of support. Jacinta probably just been like, oh, here she goes again.
Yeah.
But because the philosophy behind that, and I really push that, is that if you are coming to me for support with a student, you're not coming for me to help a student. I'm here to help you as the adult.
Right.
Don't expect this to be a mission to fix kids. What we're really doing, to be honest, is this is a mission to fix adults.
No, I mean, incidentally, Hispanics, and the ones I know in our community are, I mean, there's no lack of motivation. And the kids aren't the problem, like you're saying.
Yeah.
I hate to do this. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
because
I know.
This is so brilliant, but we've got about 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, if I could just say really quickly, those kids often go home to the parents not being there, other siblings taking care of them. They're not getting reinforcement of what they got in the classrooms either. Also, they tend not to be good test takers as well, you know, so that's an issue. And also, the parents will take them out for a couple months out of the year to go back to their home countries. And then they come back and they have to start all over again. And then we get kids from other countries that you don't know what education they've gotten in their countries. So they have to start off, you know, probably grade levels below, the age that they are because they didn't get instruction. So it's many factors that play into this.
And my challenge to staff is, so we know that.
Yeah.
Mhm,
I already know this.
we do.
So am I going to try to continue to, you know, what's the saying, fit a square peg in a round hole?
Gotta be
Or am
innovative.
I going to address the actual shape of what I'm dealing with and tailor my work, my instruction, my environment to support the child, not what I want it to be, but what it actually is.
See, that's the thing. If you teach the teachers, if you teach all of us, if you teach the parents, then everything else is in the day. And you can't say we're looking at what they're not getting because they're away for 2 months. Maybe there's something that they're getting that can be, used to build on, but you have to stay in the moment.
And the beauty of having a strategic plan with very clear goals is that you don't get to pick and choose what you're going to work with.
Right.
You don't get to decide that, well, Billy can't do this because he's gone 2 months out of the year. You can't decide that because we've said, we're going to do this for Billy. So work it out.
Right.
Powerful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll be back.